spending my life around young adults, people in their late teens and early 20s, one of the things that always strikes me is how protean their lives are. Young people away from their families and communities of origin have a kind of project of constructing their own identity. That's the time of life that they're going through. Give themselves different names, or people still, somebody will be, oh, call me Boston from now on, that kind of stuff. Or I'll see someone come in from their town where they graduated from high school, and they've got some style that they bring with them up to the college. They're all gothed out or something or the other. And then I'll see them walking down the hallway or a year later, and they will completely change. Their whole sort of persona that they're presenting will be completely different. Then another thing I notice with young adults is that they'll have styles that they'll sort of take on and off that are really express a whole persona, but they'll have 4 or 5 of them. So anyway, the reason that I mentioned that is that what I want to talk about today is a philosophy that is very popular with young people and a perennial favorite at the university. And when I say that, I don't mean to put it down. I mean to maybe point out something about why it is a perennial favorite, and one of the reasons why it is an interesting philosophy, which, as you know me, I approach a lot of philosophy as, among other things, I believe that philosophy just simply is literature and must be approached as literature in order to be authentically approached at all. And that doesn't mean that that's the only way that I approach philosophy. And the thinkers that we're going to talk about today are like the philosophes. They're people who write philosophy, but they write novels and plays and all kinds of stuff. I'm talking about, of course, existentialism. Existentialism, which is a philosophy of freedom, a philosophy of self-creation, but also a hard philosophy, I think, when it's appreciated. Hard in what way? Not hard in a technical way, hard in the kind of demands that it makes on us, because existentialism is an argument for freedom, human freedom that is championed by existentialism, precisely because when we appreciate our freedom, we appreciate our responsibilities. So that's another one of the things that we want to get at today. So a little bit of context on that. Something we've heard about a bit before is phenomenology, the logos of the phenomena, the science or the study of the experience, or the content of the experience. From Kant, the study of the nature and structure of human experience. Okay, talking about human experience itself. And of course, this comes out of Kant, who tells us that what we want to do is to understand our own thinking. That is, Kant's Copernican revolution, as he called it, was moving away from what he and the rest of the Enlightenment thinkers thought of as speculative metaphysics, and looking at the human mind itself on the premise, Kant's premise, that it was the structure of the human mind, the structure that the human mind imposed on the contents of sensory experience, that philosophers really needed to study, this kind of turning inward. And as that second point on the slide there, itself based on Descartes' concept of the cogito. Let's think about that for a second. I think, therefore I am. So there's something that's thinking, a sense of something that's thinking, that by virtue of the fact that there's no doubt that there's something that's thinking, must then surely be different from all of the contents of thought. That's Descartes, but that's also Jean-Paul Sartre all the way. We're going to be talking today about Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone De Beauvoir, basically. So Edmund Husserl at the turn of the century develops the notion of phenomenology, and the idea there, and of course in the face also of the challenge of natural science and empiricism, the sort of philosophical companion of natural science. And so the challenge there for Husserl and the phenomenologists was to show that natural science, including studying the human body or human origins, could go along, but there would always be, the premise here is, a freestanding phenomenology, a freestanding logos of experience that's always going to be something that's different from reductive material science. Phenomenology then, among other things, a response to reductive materialism, the reductive materialism of the age. Another thing to notice then, the last bullet point on the slide there about phenomenological arguments. They are basically, what is a phenomenological argument? Is it like a logical argument, like given this and given that, this other thing follows? No, it is not. Is it an empirical argument? Look, if I do this experiment, this is the result that I got. No, it's not. It's a appeal to a phenomenological argument says, look, is this not the case? Is this not the way that it is for you? And you either say, yeah, you're right, it is the way that it is for me. Or you say, no, I don't feel it. I don't experience things like that. The French Impressionist painters that we've been looking at, in a sense, are phenomenologists in as much as they are studying the qualitative properties of their own sensory experience, and that's what they're trying to express on their canvases and their paintings. So French Impressionism is very phenomenological. Phenomenology in general being part of this modernist movement, along with Impressionist painting and some of the writers that we're going to be looking at soon. So, so what these existentialists will be doing is describing consciousness, and the way the argument works is that you are either persuaded and find their description of conscious experience to be compelling, or you are not and do not. And and in that way, it's, as I say, it's like an argument from intuition. If someone doesn't have the same intuition, then that's the end of that. It's it's an appeal. So, all right, let's talk about Sartre. As I say, we're going to just keep ourselves to Sartre and De Beauvoir for the most part today. France did not have a good war in World War II. France was defeated and occupied by the Germans, and in general, the experience was rather ignominious, not only because of military defeat at the hands of the Germans, but also because during the occupation, many people, certainly including Sartre, felt that French integrity was greatly compromised and had been a deeply humiliating, the occupation had been a deeply humiliating experience. And so it seemed like France had sort of lost, in a way, sort of twice over. For Sartre, it was the psychological unreality. The Germans, according to Sartre's account of the situations, had been told to be polite to the Parisians, not to act like brutes. And they were, very clean-cut, polite people. And so the Parisians then acted the way one acts to a well-put-together, polite person. That is, they take them seriously, and if they want to know which way to go somewhere, you tell them where to go, and that sort of stuff. And Sartre felt very disturbed, because it seemed to him as if just the very act of being polite and civil around the occupiers was itself sort of being complicit in some kind of appalling crime, which in a sense it was. There's always that question about what is it reasonable to expect from a person, and I think for a Frenchman like Jean-Paul Sartre in World War II, he really felt that he was all the way up against the wall on that question of how much resistance, how much truth checking is reasonable for a person. Is it unto death? Many people have claimed so, and some have lived that. Also, he tried to find a role as an intellectual. This is characteristic of him. He's always very self-conscious of his leadership role as an intellectual in society, and he became very disillusioned. So here's World War II. I mean, basically, let me just step out, to speak about it more broadly. So here you are in the wreckage of World War II. And the Holocaust, the death camps have been discovered. Millions of people have been killed. And so now everyone's saying, well, and you're having trials and so on, but it's not just the Germans, it's the French and it's the Russians and it's everybody else, right? Everybody's under this light of saying, look, it wasn't my idea, but I was loyal. I was just loyal to my country. I had to be loyal to my officers. I, after all, was simply acting in what I felt was what I had to do in the interest of my nation. In other words, I was just following orders. I was just one of a group of people, and so I was determined to participate in these events the way that I did because of my identity, because of the collective identity that I shared as a Frenchman or as a German or as a Russian and so on. So this becomes the nut that Sartre wants to crack. Standing in the ruins of Europe in the end of World War II, he wants to telegraph home to everyone, every individual, that responsibility is at the individual level. Whether or not that's completely true, and by the way, we'll talk about, he understands that that's a radical stance, and we'll talk about that particularly at the end here. So what is his project? His project is to maximize the individual's sense of moral responsibility for determining their own course of action. And his motivation for doing that is the horrors of World War II, essentially, speaking very broadly. And the way that he's going to do that is by giving us an analysis of freedom. So the other thing then that I will say, we'll go back to the slide, is notice that basic fundamental relationship between responsibility and freedom and responsibility. To judge someone, either to blame them or to praise them, to say that what they did was either good or bad. It has to be that I think that they could have acted otherwise. If I don't think they could have acted otherwise, then I'll have no motivation. I will not, in fact, praise or blame them. And if I do, but then I realize that they could not have acted otherwise, I'll realize I was mistaken in offering them praise or blame. So in order to be responsible, you have to be free to have chosen otherwise. But if you are free to have chosen otherwise, then you are responsible. Freedom and responsibility. That's really the paradox, because we think maybe freedom might be the absence of responsibility. But what Sart understands is that real freedom is, in fact, just identical with real responsibility. Freedom is what responsibility is all about. Okay, so let's go back then, and we can keep our eye on the ball that way. That one up there, maybe you can see. So being and nothingness, and the whole theory is kind of in the title, being and nothingness. Nothingness being his theory of consciousness. Consciousness is nothingness, and being concrete being, the physical world. So being and nothingness. Two sort of things in this world, being and nothingness, although he wants to locate the etiology of nothingness, the origins of it, just sort of in a relationship with the material world itself. This phenomenology had been around for some time. Now, Sartre writes being and nothingness in late 1930s, early 1940s. And in particular, apparently during that nine months when he was a prisoner of war. But there was a long tradition developing this tradition of phenomenology, talking about the emergence of the self, the conscious experiencing self, through its experience, particularly with time. Henri Bergson, who was perhaps the most famous at the time of all of these people, not as read as much today, time and free will, tying our ability to see into the future and see into the past, if you will, with our ability to make non-determined decisions. Heidegger with being and time, and thinking that our sort of intentional consciousness, our consciousness that wants to do things in the world, is one that reflects our experience of living in temporality with an oncoming time. And then internal time consciousness, as the title implies, by Husserl, just at this point, trying to really give descriptions and analyses of what it was like, and really sort of doing it, as was Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who was a contemporary and close friend of Sartre and De Beauvoir eventually falling out with them, but all of these people are always falling out with each other. And another thing then about these phenomenologists also is that they are, remember I've been mentioning Kant and then also Hegel and Hegel's dialectical thinking, that you have something, any sort of positive thesis sort of provokes a response, but this is the way that time kind of moves forward from this movement from thesis to antithesis to the synthesis. And this is something that all of these people are getting from Hegel. So there's this big influence by Kant and Hegel in the background all the time with these sort of continental early 20th century philosophers. So what is Sartre's theory of consciousness then? Remember, he gives us a theory of consciousness. This theory of consciousness grounds freedom, and freedom motivates massive responsibility. That's what we're walking through here. So what is consciousness? Consciousness is negation. That is, what a conscious being is a center of pure negation. What does that mean? That means that when I look at anything and say, I look at the object, in looking at the object, Sartre says, and seeing the object, I see it and I realize that it is not me. And that happens at two different levels. It happens at this kind of level, this sensual level, where I can see that I'm not body. Eventually, right, understanding according to Sartre that I'm also not my own body, which again is very Cartesian. But then at that sensual level, but then also at the perceptual level, if I bring it under a concept, well, that's a cup. Then that also is a negation in the sense that I'm not one of those. I'm not that particular thing. I'm not a member of that category, but I'm not any particular thing, and I'm not a member of any category. I am, what am I? I am a perceiver, but in perceiving things, I realize that I am not them. That sort of reminds me of Berkeley. I got to think about Sartre and Berkeley now. So being, again, everything that's concrete, but myself as an experiencing no thing. I'm not a thing, I'm the no thing. I'm the thing that's not a thing. I've noticed something about Sartre's theory of consciousness. All consciousness is the same according to Sartre, because all consciousness is negation. Negation is pure. So to the extent that I am negation, I'm pure negation. To that extent, I'm identical to every other being that is a center of pure negation. Is that similar to anything? Yeah, it's interestingly similar to Plato, because Plato says, to the extent that we are rational, we are identical, because all rationality is one, is a oneness. So both Plato and Sartre have theories of consciousness which entail that the consciousness of all human beings is identical, indistinguishable, which looks to me like some kind of interesting problem. But anyway, how does it work then? How does the argument for freedom work? So I am a center of negation. Everything I see and become aware of and bring under concept is something that I then also see that I am not. I am the thing that is not a thing. Okay. But then, and this is, of course, is complicated because I have a past and my past is concrete. So I have to live with the concreticity of my past. And obviously, my body is a concreticity. This relationship with the body is one Sartre has trouble with. He doesn't want to be a dualist. He tries really hard not to be a dualist. He doesn't think that saying that consciousness is a center of negation is a mind-body dualistic thing to say, which is, I don't know, that's a metaphysically interesting proposition. Okay, so last bullet point there, and it's refusal to identify with anything concrete except its own past. The self is free of any essential determinants. And that's where the word existentialism. Essentialism, the essence comes before the individual. That's Platonism, and it's Kant too. That is that human conceptual scheme, which Kant thinks is universal, by the way, is what is there and what makes a person by virtue of participating in that. So essentialism, this classical view that there is a human essence that precedes each individual human. Each individual human is understood by understanding the human essence. Think of the ancient Greeks, of course. So existentialism, that is, it is existence itself, and that is this, well, what is it? It's the center of pure negation, but then what does it do? It can construct itself then. So existence preceding, quote, essence, unquote, right? Essence in the sense that the existentialist has willed themselves to be someone. The only existentialist really does is Kierkegaard, but anyway. And yet at the same time, right, this is not some kind of monistic naturalism. It doesn't seem that way to me. The center is the self of negation, and as such, it's an emptiness. And that's not an obviously naturalistic thing to say. But the argument is phenomenological, Sartre is saying, but isn't it like this? Isn't it true, folks, that when you bring something under your attention and your perception, you realize you are not that thing? But then you can also do that, and this is what we're going to get to now, with stuff like your anger, right, and all kinds of other stuff. Because a central critical concept here is bad faith. What is bad faith? Man is condemned to be free. I don't want to be as free as I am. I don't want to have all these choices that I have. It's too much. I have to make some decisions. I have to, if you will, sort of construct an identity off the rack, because I can't just be a negating center of nothingness. I have to put a life together. I'm also a human being with a life cycle and all the rest of the wonderful stuff. So, all right. So what do? Well, I say I'm a this and I'm a that. I'm this way and I'm that way. What am I? I'm all these labels we put on everybody these days. I mean, I'm a straight man. I'm a middle-aged man. I'm an American. I'm white. I'm waspy. I'm this and that. I like this music. I have those politics. The way that I define myself. And it's really, Sart is going to say that all of that stuff has to always come under interrogation. Think, for example, of, so it's a very harsh doctrine, right? Think about marriage, for example, although he's correct about that, and I am speaking as a married person here in case you're wondering. But look, yeah, marriage is definitely, it's a decision. The decisions are ongoing. We can't wave a magic wand and just have something set so that we don't have to worry about it anymore. A relationship, for example, is something that needs to be worried about, or that's one way of putting it, every instant of itself, because that's sort of what it is. I mean, a marriage is a real thing. You can't tell yourself that now you don't have to make any decisions and now you don't feel anything about it. You get the point. It's every minute. Sartre constructs a theory of freedom based on conscious negation. And again, man is condemned to be free. I don't want it to be that I'm choosing to be loyal every day. I don't want it to be that I'm choosing to have the persona that I have on an ongoing basis. I just want the persona to be there and work for me. But I can't do that, Sartre says. So notice why is he so radical? Because his motives are so intense coming out of his experience of World War II. This is a really engaged line of thought. It's what you call in religious studies soteriological. Existentialism, if you absorb its teachings and agree with it, is meant to change your life. It's not meant to just be some sort of passive information. It's supposed to be that there's a way of living, which is an existential way of living. What exactly that is, to the extent that that's a success, I will leave to you. A critical comment I'd make is that I think a lot of existentialist literature sort of all reads like a prolegomena to some future, free act or a good faith act. But Kierkegaard says, okay, well, I'll make a good faith act to be a Christian. he actually does something. It's hard to find a lot of existentialists who actually do anything. They're always busy telling us about how they're radically free, and they could do. Anyway, as someone who admires the line, I mean, that would be one critical thing I would say. So anyway, second bullet point, as I was saying, Sart says all the way down your religion, your ethnic identity, your sexuality, all these things which by the way, we like to think of as much more plastic today. I mean, today we think of it as enlightened to see a lot of this stuff, notably sexuality, as something that's more plastic than was traditionally held. Well, the existentialist is the prophet of the age in that sense, because the existentialist really wants to insist that we have a radical freedom to live. And Sart says, by the way, compare this with Hobbes's or the Enlightenment liberal notion of freedom. Hobbes says that Sart says you're radically free in a prison cell when you can't move around at all, but you're still radically free to construct your persona and experience the world the way that you do. Again, for what it's worth. And as I mentioned in the last bullet point, a couple things. First, so Kant sees this kind of plenum. Kant says, look, here's the conceptual scheme. All humans sort of process and organize the sensory input by virtue of this rationalist conceptual scheme. And when you introspect, that's what you will see. That's what you'll be looking at. And Sart says when you introspect, and what you see and what you're looking at is nothingness. By the way, if that seems phenomenologically persuasive, I highly recommend also that you take a look at Buddhism, because Buddhism is a very old tradition that's been around for thousands of years. And for various doctrinal reasons of their own, they have sustained attention to the nature of consciousness. So a phenomenology and existential, and they think that thinking outside of the box, if you will, and taming the mind that way is a soteriological project. So I would just again suggest, if you think that existentialist theories of consciousness are interesting, then I would recommend you to Buddhist theories of consciousness, which are along some of the same lines. And there's a very long and good tradition. Okay. So Simone De Beauvoir then. Now, Simone de Beauvoir herself used to complain that because of her lifelong relationship with Jean-Paul Sartre, and because of the fact they had an open relationship that involved many lovers on both sides, as well as lovers that they both shared, that when she went traveling or speaking, people would always want to talk to her about her relationship with Sartre and her open relationship with Sartre. Of course, this was the 1940s, 50s, 60s. And it was something that everyone found very fascinating. But de Beauvoir complained, and in retrospect, certainly at least we can appreciate that she very rightly complained that her own work was always somewhat obscured, more than Sartre's work was. People didn't chase Sartre around asking him about his open relationship with Simone de Beauvoir all the time. And de Beauvoir pointed out that she was defined much more by all of that than he was. It's an unavoidable fact, if you're going to discuss both of them, that they did in fact meet very early at one of the most prestigious universities in France. Sartre came in first in the final exam. De Beauvoir came in second. She was the youngest person ever to pass the exam at that time. They were young, they met there, and they formed a relationship, an intimate relationship, which went on all of their lives. They were partners all of their lives, but they didn't always live together. De Beauvoir lived with other men, sometimes for years at a time. She had several very important relationships. The American novelist Nelson Algren was a great love of hers. But anyway, enough of that. Let's talk about what she had to say. I'm not going here into the case of either Sartre or de Beauvoir into their novels or plays, although both of them have both novels and plays which are philosophically interesting and that we could discuss. So those are things to look at. What I will talk about here is her book, The Second Sex, published in 1948. She has an essay called The Ethics of Ambiguity, which is also a good statement of existentialism in general. It's a little before that, but many important novels and feminist writings. She is indeed a important feminist writer. So The Second Sex, 1948, very early for what we would call the third wave of feminism. The first wave is around the anti-slavery movement, late 18th, early 19th century, up to Seneca Falls, and then third wave is sort of the suffragette movement and voting rights movement, with the temperance movement around the turn of the century, early 20th century, and then third wave feminism, kind of what you might call 60s feminism. Again, not coincidentally coming up with the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, and taking off philosophically really in the 70s. But Simone De Beauvoir writes The Second Sex in 1948. And so that makes her a real founder of sort of 20th century feminism. The Second Sex is very scrupulously loyal to the principles of existentialism. De Beauvoir very enthusiastic about existentialism and adherent to existentialist principles, along with her partner, Sart. There's always been some academic discussion of how much they influenced each other, but it looks to me like that's too ambiguous to be sorted out. So what she does is take existentialist ideas. What are these existentialist ideas? That we think that we are this and we are that, we are a this and we are one of those, and we do this, we construct this identity that we assign to ourselves because we don't really want as much responsibility as we would have if we realized what is true, that much of that is actually ongoing decisions and choices that we make that could be otherwise. But Hegel, in a famous passage of his Phenomenology of Spirit, the passage on the master and the slave, and Hegel talks about how we define each other in the eyes of the other. The other looks at me, and I see the way they're looking at me, and I see what they're seeing in me and what they think of me. And I do internalize that. I see them looking at me as object, and I do internalize that. And so that's a key idea, and that's obviously, of course, a key idea in contemporary feminism as well, as this notion of coming under that oppressive gaze of the other and being objectified under the gaze of the other. And that's the existential contribution to feminism that's still very much around, because that's really where that comes from. That's that sort of, and of course that dialectical flavor. Another thing we're going to talk about in a moment is existentialism is dialectical and Marxism is dialectical, and this connection between existentialism and Marxism is close that way. So applying all of this theory to the objectification, the oppression of women is something that her most historically significant work. So as I say, existential Marxism, Marxist existentialism. I think it wouldn't be right not to mention, and I think many people, when they teach existentialism, the French existentialism, whitewash out the strong Marxist content, but that I think is a disservice to the thinking of Sartre and De Beauvoir, who were both committed Marxists and who both worked hard on navigating the intersection of existentialism and Marxism. Marxism aside, as existentialists, they saw the need for the enlightened individual to try to change the world for the better, having realized the way that they could change the world. And so this whole raft of issues that confronted people in the 1950s, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, the end of colonialism. Of course, France had the war in Algeria for Algerian independence, which was a very atrocious war, as well as the United States war in Vietnam during this time, starting in the early 1960s and raging through the 1960s. The French, of course, having been thrown out of Vietnam in 1954. and their own colonial war in Vietnam. Indochina, of course, was formerly a French colonial territory. So they had a fraught relationship with Soviet communism. This was a problem for left-wing intellectuals in Europe in the first part of the 20th century, and many of them, of course, initially supported communism and the communist revolution in a sort of optimistic way. But then a big part of the decades leading up through the middle of that century is how any given intellectual, Merleau-Ponty, for example, handled the ongoing revelations about how Soviet communism turned out. I think, and it's just an aside, I think in both Russia and China, what you see are traditional Russian and Chinese political structures being expressed through socialist ideology. That's just an aside. So Sart publishes Being and Nothingness in 1945, but the Critique of Dialectical Reason he publishes in 1960. And as far as he was concerned, that those two were his main books, and those two books were the books which together expressed his main ideas. And basically, the compromise he makes in the Critique of Dialectical Reason is, the existentialism is a philosophy of the individual. The individual is there and looking out at the world and is confronted with their own radical freedom in the face of this kind of experience. But the socialist holds that we are collective beings, which we surely also are. We are even biologically group animals. Our collectivity is not some sort of political construct. It's part of our very nature as biological beings. So existentialism cannot be an abandonment of collectivity. There's got to be such a thing as a collective existential experience. And basically that's the idea. In the Critique of Dialectical Reason, though, Sartre says, okay, you've got your physical concreticity, which is your body and your past. And that in a sense is there always. And then you've got your annihilating, negating consciousness, the engine of your freedom. But then he says, you also have what he calls the sediment of history. He also famously in Being and Nothingness says, the trail of the human serpent covers everything. That is to say, each one of us as an individual is embedded in a constructed cultural context. And subsequently, the whole critique of language by people like the deconstructionists or Louis Althusser or others is coming out also of the sense that our language is part of our past and it's a construction that to some extent constrains us. And we have to sort of try and work our way out of it or see around it somehow. That's a very European philosophical idea. Here they are, very young students in front of the statue of Balzac in Paris. Very nice looking picture of both of them. Looks like that actor. The duty of the intellectual throughout their lives and into old age. They were active in the sense of going out on the streets, showing up for demonstrations, making a lot of trips to capitals around the world that were in disfavor in the West in order to try and build bridges and show solidarity. In 1953, the communist revolution in China was 1948, 1949, when Mao finally solidified power and the West freaked out. They didn't recognize China. They recognized the nationalist government in Taiwan as China. They still were going to roll back China. There was talk about using nuclear weapons against them during the Korean War. So it was very significant then in 1953, during those times, that when generals in the United States, 1953, 1954 specifically, are saying, let's use our nuclear weapons. Let's use our nuclear weapons to force China to submit to us. And so Sart and De Beauvoir went to Beijing. And they made many other similar trips. Here they are on their trip to Cuba in 1960, looking at the Cuban Revolution. Che Guevara. And in 1980, the streets of Paris lined with thousands and thousands of people, which is interesting. Sartre's philosophy is really, pretty, it's not just its sort of, it's radicalism, but I mean, it's abstraction. And yet he became such an important figure. What did he stand for? He stood for freedom as the very basis of individual responsibility. That sort of world building paradox that he glued together. Finally, just as the last slide here, in the 1980s, when I was in graduate school in Boulder, Colorado, my teacher was Hazel Barnes. She was the English language translator of Being and Nothingness. She knew Sartre and De Beauvoir. Her last year teaching in the fall semester, she went through Being in Nothingness with us for a semester. In the spring semester, she went through the Critique of Dialectical Reason. And I'll never forget that year. So Hazel Barnes, thank you. And with that, I'm going to go off and eat some French cuisine. I'm going to go have some pommes frites, I think.